The not so famous amendments, Part B. So these amendments that we're going to talk about in this video segment are amendments that don't get a lot of attention. They're not very exciting in many ways. They're not like your civil liberties, the right to bear arms or the right for free speech and press, and to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. The Bill of Rights, in other words, seem to be a little more exciting. The Reconstruction Amendments and those amendments dealing with voting also seem to get a little more attention. But these amendments are important, and they do cover some things that apparently the country as a whole thought needed to be added to the Constitution. So you should have watched Part A already. So in Part B, we're going to talk about the 20th, 21st, 22nd, 25th, and 27th Amendments. So the 20th Amendment changes a few things in the Constitution. The main thing that most people remember about the 20th Amendment is that it changes the inauguration date from March to January. So if you're elected president, the way it works is in November, the people vote. State by state, every state has their elections, plus Washington, D.C. But in the month of December, the electors meet. And we'll learn about the Electoral College in this course. But these electors will meet in December and they will cast their vote. They actually are the ones picking the president. Under the old constitutional part dealing with when the president took the oath of office, it stated that the president would take his oath or her oath in March. Well, over time, the country had felt like that was a little bit too long to wait for a new president to sit on the sidelines waiting to be sworn in, while an old president, an outgoing president, was still able to do things for a period of about 4 months. This is often referred to as a lame duck. So a president or anyone who's elected to office who either isn't running for re-election or has lost re-election and they're still in office is called a lame duck. So this is an old political term, kind of like a duck who can swim but can't fly, or fly but can't swim. They still have some abilities, but they're not their full self. So a president who's lost an election, for example, who's just waiting for the new person to be sworn in, doesn't have as much political power. He's lost a little bit of his edge or her edge heading into the last few months before they actually leave. So under the old system, a lame duck president would be in office all through December, January, February, March until they're sworn in. And so the people of the country thought, well, maybe we should boost this up a little bit, move it up a little bit. So now the president is sworn in on January 20th. So if you've ever wondered why when you watch the president get sworn in, it's on January 20th, why that day? It's because of the 20th Amendment, 2020. That's how I remember this amendment. So again, the president can be sworn in on a Sunday, any day of the week. Right? And if they tried to move the date of the presidential inauguration, that would be unconstitutional. So if someone's elected president and they say, well, I don't really want to do it on a Sunday. All my friends and family can't get here. I want to do it on a Monday. No, you do it on January 20th, because if you try to move it, it would become unconstitutional. This amendment also sets the date of when Congress starts meeting. That's also in January. It's a little earlier in January. And this also sets out the rules that if the president-elect dies, somewhere between after the electors meet and pick him as president or pick her as president and the time that they're supposed to be sworn in, if they were to die, this amendment says that the vice president-elect, when we say elect, we mean they've been elected, but they're not sworn in yet. Then the vice president-elect would take over as the president-elect and be sworn in as president. But the main feature of the 20th Amendment is that the president and vice president are sworn in on January 20th, the 2020. 20th Amendment deals with January 20th. Now, the 21st Amendment is a little easier to remember because, we've already talked about the 18th Amendment, which said there would be no alcohol in the United States. The 21st Amendment, after a period of about 12 or 13 years, the country says, we really would like to bring our alcohol back. So they basically pass an amendment to repeal an earlier amendment. This is the only amendment of all 27 that does this. So the 21st Amendment basically undoes the 18th Amendment. So the 18th Amendment said there will be no alcohol. The 21st Amendment says, no, there will be alcohol now. This is passed in 1933. So prohibition is over. And one of the main reasons was during that time when alcohol was illegal in the United States, there are so many places selling alcohol kind of illegally or secretly that it really just made alcohol, more of something that was done kind of illegally, and it caused a lot of problems. And so they just figured that there'd be less problems if they just made it legal and regulated it a little bit more. So the 21st Amendment, so 21, at the age of 21, you're allowed to drink in this country. Now you can see by reading this short little amendment at the top, it just basically says the 18th article of the amendment to the Constitution is hereby repealed. This doesn't deal with the age of drinking at all. They leave that up to the states, but most states have made it 21. The federal government kind of really encourages states to make it 21, and they encourage that through a variety of ways, and we'll talk about that throughout this class. So the 21st Amendment says now alcohol is legal in the United States. The 22nd Amendment deals with presidential terms. So we have to go way back to George Washington. You might remember this from your social studies classes. George Washington decided after 2 terms that he would not run for a 3rd term. He could have. There's nothing in the Constitution at that time saying he couldn't run, but he felt 2 terms was enough. So every president after him stopped at 2 terms. Some presidents did not get elected a 2nd term, but if they did get elected a 2nd term, they decided 2 was enough. It was good enough for George Washington. It's good enough for me. It wasn't until we get to the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, gets elected president. During really an extraordinary time in American history. We were having a Great Depression, and then, of course, World War II. So Franklin Roosevelt decides after 2 terms that he would like to go for a 3rd term, and he wins. And then, after a 3rd term, he decides I should probably go for a 4th term. After all, we are in the middle of this great world war. He gets elected for the 4th term. Now, he dies shortly after taking office for that 4th term, but that's a long time to be president. So about a decade later, in the 1950s, the country decides, we don't really want people running for president again and again and again and again. We like the idea of what George Washington had in mind, 2 terms, so a total of 8 years. So they passed the 22nd Amendment, 2 terms, 22nd, that you can't be president no more than 2 terms. Now, the fine print on this would be, technically it says in the 22nd Amendment, that no more than 10 years total. So if you happen to be a vice president and your president dies and you take over for a couple years, 2 years let's say, then you could run for president for 4 years. That's a total of 6 so far. Then you could run for another 4 years. That gives you 10. But if you add it up any other way and it is greater than 10, then you can't do it. For example, if you're the vice president and after 1 year the president dies, then you take over the remaining 3 years, right? So you've been now president for 3 years. You could run election for a re-election, or election, I should say, and you get elected. That's 3 years plus 4 years is 7. So you could not run for an additional term because 7 plus another 4 more years would give you 11. And that's greater than the 10 total that's mentioned in the 22nd Amendment. So 2 terms, 22nd Amendment. And it is funny because from time to time you'll get popular presidents who people love who will say, well, we want them to go for a 3rd term. This happened a lot when President Obama was winding down his second term. This happened a lot when George W. Bush was winding down his second term, Bill Clinton. A lot of people say they'd like their president to run again. And even this funny little icon that says Trump 12 more years. It's just kind of funny because you can only go for 2 terms. So no more than 10 years total. Speaking of former President Trump, since he lost re-election, he's only been president for 4 years. He is able to run for re-election. He could run for president again in 2024 or even later if he is able to. But it's a real possibility. This has happened a few times in American history. So the 22nd Amendment, 2 terms for a president. The 25th Amendment deals with really when something happens to the president. This clarifies the Constitution a little bit. It is mentioned in Article 2 of the Constitution, what would happen if the president should die or leave office. But it is not very specific. So the 25th Amendment clarifies that. It clarifies a lot of things dealing with vacancies. For example, the big one that had happened quite a bit in American history was what happens if the vice president were to die or to resign. And we've had several vice presidents die or resign. And usually there just would not be a vice president for a while until there would be a new election. But there was an idea of thinking that maybe we should actually have a system in place. So if the vice president were to die or to resign, the president then would pick someone who would be confirmed by the House of Representatives and the Senate. This happened with Gerald Ford in the 1970s. The vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned, and the president, Richard Nixon, got to pick someone to be vice president. Gerald Ford was approved by the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then became vice president. And in a weird twist of fate, President Nixon resigned, and therefore Gerald Ford then became president. He's the only president ever to become president who's never was really elected vice president by the people or president by the people. It's also, this amendment deals with if the president would become incapacitated, so perhaps sick or maybe has a stroke or heart attack. They're still alive, but they can't really perform their functions. This amendment talks about how the vice president would take over, or if they believe the vice president and the cabinet believe the president is incapable of being president or doing his or her job, then they can temporarily remove the duties from the president, and the vice president will become acting president. So this is kind of a longer amendment, but it really clarifies some of the what if something happens to the vice president, or what if the president has a stroke. This amendment deals with all of that. And it actually has been used a little bit more than you would think. And because throughout history, we've had many vice presidents who have quit or resigned. And finally, the 27th Amendment, this basically says that people in Congress cannot raise their pay until after an election. So they may vote to increase the salary of members of Congress, but that raise will not take effect until after an election. Meaning, if they pass a law that says they're going to get, let's say, $500,000 a year, well, they put that out there, and then the voters have to decide whether or not they agree with that. And if they agree with it, then they would vote for those people who voted themselves the raise. But if the people think, no, these people gave themselves a raise, we're voting new people in, well, the raise would go into effect, but none of the people who voted for it would get it. In other words, it's just a way of letting the people say yes or no to giving the lawmakers a raise. This amendment was actually proposed early on in 1791, but it kind of was on a shelf somewhere until someone in Texas in college decided to pursue it and said, hey, there's no rule that said that there's a time limit on this. And so in the 1980s, he worked on it. In 1992, a majority or 3/4 of all the state legislatures agreed. So the 27th Amendment says no pay raises without a vote first.